welcome. I'm Mark Mercer, the president of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, sponsoring tonight's talk. Here is Patanjali Kambhampati. He's from McGill, a chemistry professor, and he'll be speaking to us tonight. His title is Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, or EDI in STEM. Is it time for an open discussion? Pat will speak for 40 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour maybe, and then we'll have a question period. For questions, come to the microphone, please. It won't be a amplifying microphone, just a recording microphone for the video we're making. Right. Well, join me in welcoming Pat.
Thank you, Mark. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And it is quite an interesting thing that I find myself here in the Maritimes for the first time in my life, because I'm speaking not for science or about my science, which I've been doing for decades, but about issues of social or cultural import. The reason I'm doing so is because these matters, the practices of science, have become impacted by matters of social and cultural import. The example that we'll discuss is equity, diversity, and inclusion in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I point out that it's time for an open discussion because as not just a scientist, but as an experimental scientist, I think that empiricism and looking for evidence and never stopping gathering evidence is a key trait to which we should aspire. And I don't think we're practicing that as we speak. With EDI, and especially as it's applied to STEM, I find that it has been foisted upon the greater public, and especially the scientists. And I don't believe that there has been a discussion about the topic, and I believe empirically many people are against the current practices. So that's why I would say it's time for an open discussion, and I hope that I can nucleate that process or amplify that process of having an open discussion. What I bring forth on the panel here is, on the backing panel here are two quotes from Thomas Sowell, who I was telling Mark Mercer about, and is someone who I discovered in the last 5 years myself, who's become something of a famous public thinker of note. He has been around for probably on the order of 50 years, but these two quotes from Sowell illustrate some of his ideas that have come around in the popular literature of social media. For example, these are memes you find on the internet. For example, number one on top you have, next time some academics tell you how important diversity is, ask them how many Republicans there are in their sociology departments. And the answer to that question we already know, and it's literally 1 out of 100. It's negligibly small. It used to be 1 out of 3, and that's not unreasonable. 30 years ago, you could do that, but not 1 out of 100. And the second quote below is that if you have believed that everyone should play by the same rules and be judged by the same standards, that would have gotten you labeled as a radical 60 years ago, a liberal 30 years ago, and a racist today. Sowell seems to think that. I find some resonance in this quote as well. And if you live by the ideas of some combination of social thought by Martin Luther King and economic thought by Milton Friedman, these seem to be fairly reasonable foundations upon which to build societies, and we've done so, and now I believe we've jettisoned that foundation. So this is in fact my first public interview with, other than I guess you might say in real life. This is my first public interview in real life, but my first interview I had was in 2016. And at that time I was anonymous because I didn't want to be canceled, as the term had implied, has come to be known at the time. At the time there was no term cancellation, but this was some interview done by a university student. And on the top, I think we illustrate that the professor elected to remain anonymous, and they work in natural sciences. And here's where it's interesting. I'm quite open about myself. This person has been a lifelong liberal, but today refuses to be associated with either conservatives or modern liberalism or progressives. So I'm quite upfront about that. Another point raised below is in some of the discussion, someone asked, do you ever remember when academics could be open about themselves? And the person who did the interview, the student, said, no, I don't. So that represents what students think, and the student asked me what I thought, and I was afraid to say it out loud. Because here's what happened to me when I did say things out loud. I had seen other students do cancellation of professors starting around 2010, and I'd experienced several attempts to cancel me based upon my social media presence on either Facebook or Instagram. And for example, here I think is a 2019 student evaluation where the student had said that in red, I'm extremely disturbed because I'm a female student and I have questioned the idea of male privilege and the patriarchy by giving evidence like suicide victims and homicide victims, etc. So then she goes on to say, I'm not against free speech, which is a classical idea, but I do not want to be taught by someone who has posts that I dislike. This is not an uncommon occurrence for me since I think 2014 or so. Irony is other student evaluations you can see here, he's nothing short of passionate, shares to his interest in science in the most entertaining way, such a nice and funny person, very kind, what a great man, etc. So, you know, this is teaching about thermodynamics, not about history or literature. So somehow teaching about thermodynamics, actually, the student seemed to like it, but this other student seemed to find that my social media presence caused enough of a problem, so I should be canceled or something to that effect. So having said that, let's go forward and think about our journey of diversity and have an unfettered investigation. And as I was making this presentation, I was thinking about this idea of diversity and what it really means to us. And I thought to myself, as a music fan, were the Rolling Stones and the Beatles diverse? No, they were poor white men from northern Britain. Was Silicon Valley, founded from Intel to Apple to Google, diverse? And the answer is no. It was typically middle-class men of Asian and Jewish and white descent. And Intel, for example, was interesting because it was founded by two white farm boys, Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce, if I'm not mistaken, but it needed to be run by the tough-as-nails Jew who survived communism, Andy Grove. So that's bandwidth. That's true diversity. That's real diversity, diversity of experience, not of different color or whatnot, or as a Jew white or not white. But Andy Grove had a different experience that enabled him to run Google. Apple and Google, are they diverse? Well, yes and no in some ways. So what do we mean by diversity? We should consider that question. And why should we even care? We should consider that question. As I put forth this idea of diversity, we talk about the acronym. In the acronym, I used EDI initially, which is probably empirically the most commonly used acronym. I list other acronyms, but amusingly, DIE is never used. DIE is used by my colleagues Gad Saad and Jordan Peterson and people in the literature where they're discussing that we should question what seems to be a religion or a mythology of EDI. And I feel that there is also a religion or mythology of EDI, and above or to the right are certain questions that I think we should ask in the process of executing DEI. Should it exist? Should it not exist? And if we do have it exist, how do we implement it? First of all, diversity. Will there be diversity in all areas of life and work, or only some? Should it only be STEM? What about teaching? Inclusion. For all areas and all people of life, or only for some in some areas? Do we only look for diversity of, women and Hispanics? Or do we look for diversity of Jewish men? Do all lives matter equally? Equity. There will be equality of outcomes for all people in all areas of life, or only selectively? So we somehow have to have the same equity and outcome for physicists, but maybe not for other areas of life. Is that reasonable, let alone the bad areas of life? So I begin with, I guess in the newspaper they call the lead, the narrative, or what I find the most dislikable quality of science. They call it my scientist privilege. The idea is that I've been against a lot of these ideas of equity, diversity, and inclusion since before they had a name. Back in the 90s, it was called political correctness when I was an undergrad. Now we call it EDI. Well, I was forced into the discussion by a National Post article, I think it was last November, it turns out. And it was telling the story of how I was denied funding for an application for reasons of EDI, not for reasons of STEM. It turns out I could reapply for the application, just to make it clear, but nonetheless, the first hurdle happens to be EDI and not STEM, and that was a new result. That was never heard of 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 1 year ago about it started, and now it's become a hurdle, and I've now lost 2 proposals by not meeting the EDI hurdle. That's an unusual thing, and it was ironic considering my own sort of experiences in history, which I don't want to belabor. So then it became a National Post article. After the National Post article, what happened is that the public feedback to my story being broken has been broadly and widely appreciated by the so-called taxpayers and civilians, the general public, my neighbors. So I've received probably 1,000 emails from people of all walks of life saying thank you for speaking out, and the emails still come in. So from, as I say, so the civilians and taxpayers are, I think EDI or DIE is killing STEM and industry, art, culture, and music, and much of Western civilization. I think it is merely cultural Marxism to parallel economic Marxism of the Soviet Union, etc. Finally, I would add as an editorial comment that STEM does not need EDI or DIE. STEM works by merit and merit alone. Diversity does not help STEM any more than diversity helped the Beatles and the Stones do what they do. It was a gathering of like-minded people. That is where greatness comes from, not by making groups look like the census. There are alternatives to pledging allegiance to EDI, such as humbly practicing MFE. I note humbly practicing because there's no beliefs or pledging allegiance involved. And what you can practice is merit, fairness, and equality, which is one of the infinite possibilities of other things that you can practice. Merit, fairness, and equality was introduced in Newsweek magazine by Dorian Abed and Ivan Marinovich. And they comment, I would say, in blue, the main point, equity does not mean fair and equal treatment. DEI seeks to increase the representation of some groups through discrimination against members of other groups, often excluding applicants from certain groups. DEI violates the ethical and legal principles of equal treatment. That, of course, is country-specific. I noticed that there are differences between America and Canada with regards to whether discrimination is legal, so this is very much country-specific. Now, we'll go to stories from the front lines of social justice-based incursions into STEM. As a result of my story, I had reached out to other scientists. Here's one by the name of Trevor Charles, who is an African-Canadian scientist, and he said his NSERC had also been denied by EDI grounds. He also runs a diverse group, and he himself is a quote-unquote diverse person, for what it's worth, to use the modern language. And he has no idea why he failed his EDI, except I think probably he used classical liberal principles, as I did, judging people by the color, by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. Here's an example of EDI in action from Western University physics. Western University recognizes our commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion is central to our mandate. As a community leader, we understand that our commitment to EDI and decolonization are mutually supporting and contribute to our pursuit of research excellence. The university seeks qualified candidates who share our commitments to EDI. Candidates are expected to show evidence of commitment to EDI. This is not something you can question. This is not unlike religion, and this is not unlike communism. This is the practice from Western University's physics department in the last 1 year. Here's from Dalhousie's chemistry department in the last 1 year. This position is restricted to candidates who self-identify as a member or one of more of the equity-seeking groups below. And the equity-seeking groups essentially do everything but exclude straight white men who are not handicapped. I think they exclude Jews and Asians as well, but I'm not sure. From UC Berkeley, because it's one of the biggest universities and most impactful universities, from Reason magazine, was being argued is that the university is requiring Orwellian-like 1950s-style loyalty oaths, which were last used under the Communist Party guise. And I think what's happening now is far, far, far more significant than that. Here's an example in red. In one example, a pool of nearly 900 candidates was narrowed down to 200 candidates based solely on how convincing their EDI plans were. That's how diversity is being implemented, and at the most prestigious public university in the world, this is how it's being implemented to cancel off excellence and meritocracy and colorblindness and race blindness and gender blindness. From Canada's NSERC, some gaps more than others, and which is something that I like to call selective empathy. I think that's something that's very central to the practice of social justice, is selective empathy, which was also selective to communism, not coincidentally. So for example, from Canada's NSERC, we have this comment above: participation rates by women and visible minorities, etc., is a question. And should there be remedies to address diversity gaps? Should there be special programs to address diversity gaps is the question. So our NSERC is asking that question. Next, they ask the question, should we be ensuring parity between identity groups? What equity measures should we be taking? And should we be equalizing outcomes? This is not practice yet, but soon it will be practice, I believe. Also from NSERC, EDI does not apply to science, but it may apply to teachers, however. That's the comment I'd like to make here. Why should you have EDI in science? Does it make the science better? I don't know that it does. You could actually discuss the question, that's fine. But you can't just not discuss the question. And I think it's fairly fair to say EDI might apply to teachers and the police force for various reasons, but we don't talk about EDI for teachers or the police force. We talk about it for scientists and CEOs. So in the NSERC, they have this statement about equity, diversity, and inclusion at each stage of the research process, and the viewer can go online and read it on their own. But the comment from the text is this: EDI promotes research excellence, making it more relevant to society as a whole, ethically sound, rigorous, reproducible, and useful. And they cite this reference called Tannenbaum. I have a colleague who was a smart guy, and he'd always tell me about these silly things going on. And he would say that if you look at Tannenbaum, he actually looked at the reference. It has nothing to do with EDI. It's about sex and gender and experimental design of things like car crashes and so forth. I don't remember the details of which, but the reader can go look it up, and that's fine. But it had nothing to do with the functioning of basic science. So if we misinterpret the paper the same way that NSERC does, there's no justification for EDI in our field of science. So NSERC has basically begun to apply things selectively and strangely to science. That was, well, I guess here's some more quantitative data from Dorian Abbott, a colleague at University of Chicago. He was talking about a selection process for a competitive postdoctoral fellowship. The percent selected male, 4%, female, 19%. Look at the ratio. How did it work that way? They worked it out by not selecting any males. So what is this telling us about young males, about their place in science? The outcome is being engineered in order to get as many females in science. And this is how far they are engineering that outcome at University of Chicago. Another incident at University of Chicago was for a conference that someone was organizing where they had to have a 50-50 mix of males and females. And so in order to make it as such for the students, they make 9 males and 21 females in order to compensate for the statistics in some manner. So you see how the statistics are being engineered to make an outcome as such. Here's a more qualitative statement. In this statement, what we have is, I was on the hiring committee for my department, and we were told by the dean that they would not consider a faculty candidate from us, regardless of ability, unless it was a woman or underrepresented minority. I've certainly seen cases like that in various universities, discussing in colleagues, and I won't necessarily speak for my university, but ideas like this are discussed widely throughout university and are in practice throughout university. What happens in EDI is pledges of allegiance to EDI or DIE in STEM. Here's a report from the American Enterprise Institute that I encourage the viewer to see, which is, other than merit, the prevalence of diversity of EDI in statements of university and hiring. The main results are that DEI statements are requirements for job applications seeking university faculty posts. Proponents claim that these requirements create a more inclusive academy and so forth. Prestigious universities are significantly more likely to have these requirements, and regular faculty posts are more likely to require them than adjunct or postdoc positions. We have an example of a Pledge of Allegiance that I won't read for the case of brevity, but nonetheless there are pledges of allegiance where you have to say, how do you think about EDI? How do you implement it? Are you an ally? These are all questions that we have to now write about for the first time ever in academia, and to the best of my life, outside of communism. There are statistics now about EDI in terms of school prestige, and there's more EDI requirements that correlate with school prestige or university prestige. The university requirements requiring EDI are very consistent across departments, from social science to STEM, so it's not like they're in social science but not STEM. They're there in STEM as well. And we'll skip this slide here. So another point I'd like to make here is that most of social justice-based activism in academics is based on a certain way of functioning. There's little quantitative data, and there's many quotes from personal narratives of a select handful of people. As people in STEM, we should be data-centered. I'm an experimental physical chemist, and I'm used to measuring data and analyzing data and seeing how robust it is. And I would not base ideas and public policy on qualitative statements of a half a dozen people, yet that is in fact what happens. So we'll begin with some qualitative statements of principles, not just quotes, but principles, and then we'll go to data. So being broad-minded and hoping to discuss this idea from a standpoint of all English-speaking countries, because this issue of EDI is Anglophone. It's not European, it's not other countries, it's mostly Anglophone. But it's becoming global as well. It's in India as well. From the US, we have Title VI and Title IX. Title VI excludes or prevents against discrimination based upon race. Title IX prevents against discrimination upon gender. But the whole idea is they prevent against discrimination. They don't say that you should have selective empathy. They don't say you should have special programs only for one person, not another, just that you cannot discriminate. So that is our history of Title IX, but yet here's what happens in practice. When the first empirical study of hiring in STEM was done, I think this was in 2017-ish, this was a paper published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in the last 5 years or so. The data showed that there was a 2-to-1 faculty preference for hiring women in STEM and tenure-track positions. They didn't say why it was there or should it be there. They were just being scientists, in this case perhaps economists, saying this was there. And you can decide what to do with the data, but this is the data. So there's already preferences, and yet we also have policy implementations. Are they correlated? That's the question for all of us to evaluate. But what does this imply? What does this imply? Now moving to the data. Here's data that was taken from Mark Perry at University of Michigan Flint and American Enterprise Institute. We have the share in the enrollment in degrees from 1960 to 2020 by male, female. And here was Title IX when it was passed. Here was 1979, and here we are sort of equalizing at about a 56-43 ratio. And here's the college degrees, actually more like a 58 to 41 ratio. So there's quite a big contrast ratio between males and females, and that largely took place over 1980 to 2010, it looks like. How about the college degrees by gender in different areas? If you look at across all fields, if you look at across all cells, what you'll find is that there's far more females than there are males, although that drops a little bit for PhDs. If you look at the cumulative effect, which is just the exponential effect or the growth of the aggregate effect of women being in college more, here's what you get integrated over the last maybe it looks like 30 years or so. Now, how does this breakdown of gender work for different departments? Well, therein lies the interesting point. If you look at computer science, it actually had more students in 1980 that were female and fewer students in 2010 or 2020. So computer science went down, and interestingly, there's this massive effect to get more women into computer science. Engineering went up from some 2% to maybe some 20%, but there's other fields that are 80% that went to 90%, or 60% that went to 80%. So there's many, many fields, and you see the overall numbers are skewing towards women, like 60-40. And within fields, all fields seem to be becoming more women, with the sole exception of computer science. And yet we do a lot of work to correct the question of the asymmetry of women in STEM, but not the asymmetry of men in other fields. So the bachelor's degrees in STEM are now equalized by gender, it turns out. And how about veterinary medicine? In veterinary medicine, we see that it's become 80% women to 20% men over the last 30 years. College degrees by gender, I think we went over this data. Here is college degrees by gender as well. We see some fields like nursing are 90% female. Some fields like engineering are 20% male. Should they be any way or another? Why do we only strive for gender equality in STEM? Shouldn't we strive for gender equality in nursing, public health, language, pharmacy, dentistry? And I don't have the answer to that question, but I would strongly encourage is that we ask these questions continually, openly, and freely. What about this idea of equity and equality? They all sound so nice. They make you feel good about yourself. But what do they mean in practice? So we consider other gaps, things that Canada doesn't consider in its gender-based analysis plus. Workplace fatality gaps, equity gaps, like that. So the most dangerous profession appears to be loggers, which are 90% male. Then you have fishing and pilots and roofers and construction workers and loggers and landscapers, all of which are mostly male. And we have no striving for equality or equity and outcome for those enterprises, certainly at the academic level and certainly not at the government level. Here are US occupational injuries by sex. It's 90% male, 8% female, let's say 10% female, which gets at the broader question of gender equities going in as many directions of what I like to call vector space as being a scientist as there are genders. There's many orientations, to use the language commonly used now, to issues. Omitted from any of these discussions are harms to boys. No aspect of educational outreach focuses on boys. And we have here data from Mark Perry, again, from American Enterprise Institute, who is compiling this sort of data for the course of decades. And in this case, he says, for every 100 girls and women, there are this many boys or men. And the answer is, of 100, there may be 50 that take AP honors math, that may be 70 that enter in grad school, that might be 80 that enter into college, for example. How about whose entry to kindergarten is delayed? 140. How about who die of opioid doses? 110. How about suspended from school? 240. How about expelled from school? 290. How about commit suicide? 450. How about who die in the job? 1,200. In federal prison? 1,300. So there are gaps in which our sons are not doing well. Should we address those gaps? Should we give equal outcomes to those things? And I don't have the answer to that question, but I don't think it's unreasonable to ask that question of outreach programs to our sons, given the amount of outreach programs that we have for our daughters. As a scientist, we often talk about equity, because equity is foisted upon we scientists. It is not foisted upon teachers. But what if teachers have gendered biases against boys? Somehow magically it seems that any male-censored profession has biases against girls. Why not infer by symmetry that teachers in female-centered professions have biases against boys? Is implicit bias, as it's commonly discussed by the Harvard Implicit Association Test, something that only males or whites experience? Or all humans truly built the same? Do we all have the same implicit biases? As a case in point, 80% of the kindergarten teachers are women. 50% or 60% of the secondary school teachers in Canada are women. 97% of the early childhood educators are women. So suppose these women have some implicit biases against boys. Suppose they like girls better. Who knows? I wouldn't propose one or the other than if you're going to propose that somehow males in certain employment areas have biases against young women, maybe females have biases against young men that hasn't been accrued over their life, and that might have impact. Why don't we investigate that? We don't. Another point, so we don't only talk about gender, is that we can talk about race. We'll cover both problems in this talk. And here's our first discussion of race, again with data from Mark Perry, where he shows the median U.S. household income by ancestry in 2018 it looks like. And what you have is that the white or non-Hispanic population has 68,000 it looks like, which is below slightly that of the Nigerians and is lower than that of many immigrants and much lower than that of Indian Americans, of which I am one. The point that's being made by Mark and as well the data is that inequities in racial outcomes do not imply lack of experiences with racism, the presence or absence thereof. A Nigerian also experiences racism, but it doesn't feel it the same way as an African American who might have a lower average income by quite a bit. So whether you have it or not, it's not belied in the data. Yet we only discuss racism in terms of ironically white and black in America and even in Canada, which has a very different history with regards to racisms. But before we go on to racism and races, we have this question of genderism and what I call genderism or feminism in Anglophone society. I note that Anglophone society is a thing because it's not a global phenomenon and it's not a Francophone phenomenon, it is an Anglophone phenomenon. One point as we discuss gender is what do we as scientists actually think? And one of the things that scientists generally think is that gender is not a social construct. One thing that I would say is that the laws of physics and chemistry and biology do not hold exemptions for we Homo sapiens. Here's a very nice quote from my colleague, Luana Maroja, a professor of biology at Williams University, so she can speak much more eloquently about the topic than I could. What she says is that it should come as no surprise that after over 200 million years, our journey as mammals has endowed men and women with different, although overlapping preferences. This sex ratio inequality observed in so many professions cannot be explained solely as the result of patriarchy, bias, or sexism, but are the result of deep biological differences stemming from hundreds of years of differential sexual selection. Yet in contrast, we have what is done by typical governments, especially the government of Canada, which is gender-based analysis plus. I strongly encourage any taxpayer or any interested academic or scientist to look up gender-based analysis plus. It focuses all the attention on women and girls at the expense of men and boys. For example, it even notes that for women in Canada work at full time or work an average 87 cents to the dollar. So it discusses the much maligned and much counter-proven earnings gap. I wouldn't even call it a wage gap, it's an earnings gap. They discuss domestic violence and sexual violence, where by 2020 it is now well known that domestic violence and sexual violence is symmetric and it's independent of race, gender, orientation, sexuality. It's a human phenomenon, yet somehow heterosexual women are given special priority. And they talk about leadership positions in STEM and boards, but they don't talk about other positions, for example, suicides or logging injuries or things like that. So the gender-based analysis that is part and parcel of our government program and governs how we apply for federal funding is highly selective. In STEM, there are many awards and positions that are only available to women. Here's an example, one from Nature, and I won't belabor that there's many more of them. This is a poster that I saw in 2018. It was the norm in 2015, saying the future is female. You don't see that in universities anymore, but what you do see are policies in which men are excluded from applying, and only women can apply for positions in STEM or get awards in STEM. Here's an example of how education is being designed, not just for women, but a small subset of women. Not all women think like this. This is a small subset. And the idea is from the Chronicle of Higher Education, a major education newspaper in the US, that has this article talking about how calling on random students could hurt women from 2019. So that's a fairly common article that you would see in the modern era. On the popular media, we have BuzzFeed, as it was well known at the time, popular at the time. This was 2017. So the popular media says if you're a woman and you're bad at math, blame the patriarchy. So this is how far genderism or feminism from academia has come. That's America. That was America in 2017 or 2014. What about Europe? Well, if you ask the German scientists, I have German colleagues who give me data like this. So here's something in 2019 where they have first now illustration of this phenomenon of man spreading in a cartoon where the men are somehow excluding the space of this woman, and they're giving this idea of men excluding women. So what was happening in 2010 in America is now happening in 2020 and maybe in Germany. So things are spreading to Europe now and the rest of the world. Now, what sorts of ideas are these? Who are these people putting forth these ideas? Well, here are some slides from a recent lecture that I saw in the McGill University Physics Department. This is a lecture from a feminist professor of education on the topic of EDI and STEM. The main point that I want to address is she was talking about microaggressions to women and especially minority women, and saying that the people that were microaggressing them were whites and Asians. So what I find remarkable about this is many things, but the most remarkable thing is all Asians are somehow lumped with whites, and all Asians, all 3 billion of us, are somehow magically together. And there's never been any sort of Asian differences. So somehow we're all guilty of microaggressing, especially if we're men. And then we have the final concluding point, which is just a qualitative statement. This point was discussed for minutes and minutes. Another point that was discussed is in physics, what is not required is innate genius, because it's commonplace in education to get rid of gifted and talented programs for kids. So that's at the student level. At the academic level, the idea is that physics especially, and math especially, and computer science especially require genius. And what that means is genius is a male thing, and they don't like that. So it's exclusive to certain people. So it doesn't require genius. But what physics does require is hard work, and apparently hard work is particularly comfortable for black women. So this author, a white woman, is saying that somehow physics is better suited for black women than it is for Ashkenazi Jewish men who get 20% of Nobels in physics, yet are 2% of American population or world population. This talk in physics discussed black feminist epistemology with ideas like truth is grounded in experience, truth is arrived through dialogue, truth demands caring, truth demands accountability. This has nothing to do with the world in which I live, whether as a classical liberal citizen or as a scientist, and this is especially not how science is done. Gender equality. Do our sons matter as much as our daughters? It turns out Mark Perry and another person by the name of Christophe Pegos are actually doing their part to ask that question. Because of people like Mark's data, they're saying, should we have things to make up these gender gaps in academia? If you're going to talk that much about gender gaps, let's have these gender gaps remedied. And they're now questioning the legality of many of these gender-biased scholarships to only women, considering that they already account for the majority of students in awards. I like to invoke this idea of apartheid 2.0. And this was a recent article in Canada Post in which it was being noted that able-bodied white men are unable to apply for some positions in STEM. And this is absolutely true, as we've denoted in some of the anecdotal evidence. But that's the reason of this article. one thing I would comment is that the diversity cult is nothing more than apartheid 2.0. It's a massive collusion between activists and academia and government. Apartheid and the death of STEM and all of its benefits to humanity, like cures for diseases and renewable energy and progress in general, will be hindered and harmed by this implementation of STEM, just like communism. So here's a quote: "Universities risk losing funding for positions if they haven't hired the designated number of research chairs by 2029 in each identity category. As a result, some resumes are going straight into the trash." So that's how things are being impacted. Apartheid doesn't influence everyone, it influences some people. They come for the scientists often before they come for other people. They don't come for the construction workers. On the question of racism, instead of just genderism, and racism 2.0, which I might call critical race theory. Here's an illustration of how far academic grievance studies as a field has come into power, especially its influence in regards to teaching of mathematics. Here's mathematics for social justice for the college classroom. Here is a talk that was being given to McGill University earlier this year. The bottom talk is notable, where the discussion point is whiteness and structural racism. But there are other ideas like creating pathways of kindness. So kindness and equity and whiteness are areas in which work must be exerted so as to correct we scientists and science itself. Remarkably, we scientists are never asked to provide critical feedback to the non-scientists who are less constrained by things like reason, logic, and evidence. This concept of whiteness, here is an article observing whiteness in introductory physics in 2022. The term whiteness is commonly invoked in the literature of both education and STEM. Notice they never say Jewness, but they are saying Asianness because there are a lot of Asians in STEM. Whiteness in physics, that's now an editorial, and I won't belabor that point any further. Critical race theory in terms of decolonization, decolonizing math. Here is an article from the media discussing how math must be decolonized, and we must teach from mathematicians who are somehow not part of white supremacy or colonist supremacy. The great irony is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, mathematician of all time was an Indian colonial by the name of Ramanujan, Srinivas Ramanujan, I think his name was, and then he left India to go to Britain to study under the second greatest mathematician who took him under his wing to study. But all this was happening under the auspices of colonialism, not decolonialism. Decolonialism is an example, ironically, of intersectionality, that of feminism and Asian or non-white studies. In this case, this author non-ironically invokes struggle sessions. She says higher education must be decolonized through study and struggle. If the reader's not familiar, struggle sessions are very common in Chinese communism. I don't think that they're as common in Soviet communism, but I'm certainly no expert on the topic. But certainly in Chinese communism, they had struggle sessions in which the student would sort of have these books and reading sessions and struggle through the ideas in order to reach wokeness, as we now call it. Hence historical isomorphisms. As one of my colleagues says, everyone is the hero of their own narrative. So what we should do is to consider the atrocities conducted under the auspices of good intentions and what connects these histories. What often connects these histories is something I like to call selective empathy, or belief in the ism of the day, whatever that intellectual fad is of the day. And we see two fantastically interesting books here. One on the Cultural Revolution, which I think should be, if not this book, the topic should be required understanding for modern social justice warriors, because you can see a lot of historical isomorphisms. The most damning one is Women of the Klan, where you see how the most hated group in America, the KKK, were actually social justice warriors themselves. Which gets at the point, where do all these things come from? What was racism 1.0? What people don't often remember is that racism in 1.0, 1850 to 1920, an academic topic. And here's Franz Boas, one of the most famous anthropologists of all time, saying, I'm going to debunk the modern day racism, but the original scholarly articles on racism were published in the same scholarly journals like Science and Nature and PNAS and so forth like that. So people studied racism in the year 1900. So what was progressive academic racism in 1900? Well, the key point is, without exception, around 1900, it was assumed that race was one of the central ways of understanding and helping human beings. This was the idea of social justice. And it was Franz Boas in 1900-ish who began the transformation against thinking about things in terms of racism, and then the new thing, which was then relativism. The next parallel that we'll introduce is genderism or feminism and the WKKK. Here's from that book that we were discussing earlier, we showed an image of earlier. A key point is, I used to have this comforting image of the KKK as an assemblage of social misfits, genetically inbred white trash. No more. I must now live with the fact that the Klan contained all the better people: businessmen, physicians, judges, social workers, Quakers, political reformers, and feminists. And actually, that's the key point. The women's KKK considered itself to be a major advocate of women's rights and interests, for white Protestant women, that is. Reading of the Klan's feminism is discovering evidence that a beloved grandmother had a secret life as a blood-sucking soul. Feminism is, after all, supposedly founded on moral principle, but so too was the Klan. And so we can go on and discuss the history, which is fantastically interesting, but you see good intentions and how they go. Here's another example of good intentions and how they go. Social justice and wokeness are modern ideas. Are they? Wokeness is modern, but social justice is not. Here's a magazine from 1936 called Social Justice, which was a racist magazine when you were actually formally racist. And this was a racist Catholic magazine run by a person by the name of Father Coughlin. And there are some emblematic titles. I saw these actually in a junk store in Maine. I really wish I'd purchased them as a historical artifact, but they were fantastic, and you can see what social justice was in 1936. So from those magazines, I came up with this little trajectory that I thought was useful for discussing ideas with people and how people are the heroes of their own narrative and are coming up with the greatest ideas of history again. Phase 1 is 1880. I just got tenure in racism theory. Phase 2 is the activists. Phase 1 was the academics. Phase 2 is the activists. Join the civic leaders in the KKK. These are the ones, the woke social justice warriors, implementing the leading theories of racism in 1910. Phase 3 is the popular peak. I'm a proud racist, aren't you? You would say that in 1930 as you were reading the Social Justice magazine. Phase 4, questions arise. Not all racists are like that. You might say that in 1960 as the civil rights activists started to ask bad questions. The civil rights advocates were the deplorables of the era. Phase 5, questions everywhere. I'm not a racist. You might start hearing that as Archie Bunker in the 1980s. Phase 6 is the end game. He's racist, he's evil. That's what I thought in 2010, and by 2020, we are clearly at the point of saying, he's racist, she's evil, we're gonna cancel you. So I like to think about these isomorphisms of good intentions ending poorly and racism versus genderism, and they're both isomorphic in this way, in that there's this belief that race A or gender A should not do bad things to race B or gender B. You don't question the symmetry of the process. It's only a one-way valve. Then one has a theory of why race A or gender A oppresses and harms race B or gender B. But one never looks about the other valve the other direction, or looking the other direction. So that's the idea of racism and genderism. Intersectionality is an idea often discussed in the modern literature and the academic literature, and it's ironic because what they do is they actually get the intersection of sets wrong and the very definition of sets wrong. What they're talking about is a union of sets, not an intersection of sets. But nonetheless, if you wanted to have true intersectionality, here's the idea of intersecting privileges. For example, you have violence against whites because violence against whites is somehow historically more important than violence against other minorities, depending on where you live, unless the minorities are the majorities, in which case it's reversed. Violence against women because violence against women matters more than violence against men. Violence against heterosexuals because violence against heterosexuals matters more than violence against homosexuals. And then you could take the various intersections, of which the peak is straight white women. So there's this idea that of intersectionality, which is completely botched, and the proper analysis is who has the privilege of their life mattering the most. Well, you can go through these intersecting rings over here and figure out the various differences. Now, we presented some data that was qualitative, some data that was quantitative, and a lot of this illustrates that there are problems out there. The problems out there involve wokeness, EDI and STEM, critical race theory, genderism, and so forth. These are the so-called best ideas of academia that are doing to academia what racism 1.0 and communism and Marxism did a century ago. Having said that, solutions are out there. So here we have 3 books that we illustrate with. The first is Woke Racism by John McWhorter. He's becoming very famous. I strongly encourage it. I brought it with me along on this trip. And John McWhorter talks about how racism and wokeness is now being discussed like modern day racism was, and has parallels to religion, although I would say the parallel is not exactly that strong, but it's a little bit reasonable. That's woke racism. Critical Theories or Cynical Theories by Pluckrose and Lindsay is a fantastic book that tells you about the ideas and where these ideas came from. The ideas of postmodernism and how postmodernism and critical theory is what's given rise to what we're seeing like critical race theory and its implementation in EDI and STEM and many other fields of life. There's a superb book by John Ellis, The Breakdown of Higher Education, which I brought with me as well. And in this book, he goes through the intellectual history and the true history of how this process from academia nucleated, evolved, and then took over much of culture. So here's an example of someone to which we can aspire. We also want to think about what we can do as individuals. And there's a history of dissident scientists questioning the isms of the day. And surely there were Nazi and communist scientists, of course, but there were certainly other scientists who were questioning that. What I would like the viewer to consider is Lev Landau, who was one of the greatest physicists of all time, and he was almost sent to the gulags for comparing Stalinism, his ism of the day, to Nazism, the ism of 10 years prior. What other historical isomorphisms were historically verboten? So, of course, he was saved from the gulag because he was the greatest physicist of the day, and they thought it would look bad to send him to the gulags. But that's the problem, is he was making those questions. He was asking those questions. So in concluding comment, I would say the following. What are the origins of the current PC SJW movement that can be discussed in light of cultural Marxism and postmodernism? The origins are in academic humanities, gender studies, and what we call grievance studies. Why do we care at all? Because these ideas have come for STEM, and they've already come for education, and then perhaps how we function as a society. They're coming for entertainment, they're coming for media, they're coming for probably political positions and corporate board positions. So these ideas of postmodernism and cultural Marxism have come for all of society. Next, where are we in our historical arc? That's a hard question to ask, but I think that these ideas really started to take place in 1980. They really became amplified in 1990 in universities. And by 2010, those university people became powerful, and they had offspring, and those offspring were millennials who were entering university in 2010. By 2020, those offspring are now becoming somewhat powerful in the media and academia, and so by 2020, we see a lot of social justice warriors in academia and media because they're powerful administrators and eager young people. So where we are in the historical arc, I think we're starting to see the first resistance. But I don't know what happens after that. What happens next? What can we do as individuals? I think that's the prescription here, is what can we do as individuals? I came up with an idea about a month ago because I had a question of how would you debate a social justice warrior or someone who's woke? And the answer is as follows. They're not going to debate you. They're going to talk about their feelings and how their feelings trump your facts. So what you can do is a very simple thing. You can say, I reject your proposition. Now please engage in a discussion, and we do so civilly. But I reject your proposal that I'm a racist. as an insult. I reject your proposal that I'm a sexist because I don't believe in this engineered outcome. I reject your proposal of slandering and name-calling. Instead, what I do is to say, I think we should have a fact-based discussion and engage and see how best we can proceed. But we're not going to engage in personal attacks and slander. And I think that's the best thing that we can do as individuals, by rejecting the proposal that you can attack a person and slander a person for what they humbly practice, let alone what they actually believe. With that, thank you for your time.
One argument, one way of thinking about EDI, giving reasons for wanting there to be some mechanisms that ensure that there's greater representation of women in particular, but I guess an analogous argument can be applied to race or sexual preference or whatever, is that there are some topics and some ways of investigating that appeal more to women than to men. And unless there's outside control, or at least outside influence on hiring committees and grant-granting agencies and the like, these topics and these ways of approaching the topics will be ignored. Have you encountered that argument, thought of that argument? The idea is that even in physics,
that's a
chemistry,
funny thing, because if you say that women have a different way of knowing and doing and valuing things on the one hand, but on the other hand you're saying they're exactly identical, so the outcomes should be the same.
Well, no,
you can't have it both ways.
That's right, but there are two arguments. I don't think these arguments are consistent.
There are two arguments, and they're completely inconsistent.
Yeah, but one argument is that indeed there are differences, if not in cognitive ability, but at least in interest.
Yes.
In interests and approaches, and that a hiring committee that's mainly men, overseen by a dean's office that's mainly men, won't appreciate the interest or the value of these topics. And
I don't know what that topic would be, because I don't think topics are racialized or genderized. Topics are great or not great. So if you look at music or art or science, it's qualitative. I mentioned Lev Landau. Mm-hmm. Why is he great? Is it because he's an Ashkenazi Jewish Russian? No. It's because, and I somehow like them more? No. It's preposterous. It's because he's everyone knows he's one of the greatest physicists of the last century, if not more. And that's a judgment area. Top 10, we'll call him top 10. He's up in the top. He's not Einstein, but he's top 10. And of course, actually, as it turns out, half of the top 10 are Ashkenazi Jewish men. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about that. Think of the statistics of that.
Well, some of the examples that are used, and again, this is a debate within feminism. This is difference feminism, where the thought is that for either physiological, genetic reasons, or for merely cultural reasons, one way or another, men and women do appreciate different things, or appreciate them in different ways, or investigate in different ways. And so one of the examples is Barbara McClintock, the biochemist, the biologist. Another example, her name slips me, escapes me. The Gaia hypothesis, the thesis that the organelles in cells were implanted bacteria in bacteria. I'm trying to remember. Can anyone help me with her name? Oh well. At any rate, the claim is that these scientists thought in a way different than the male scientists, and it took a long time for their work to be appreciated, and it wasn't really appreciated until more and more women. So there's this, the argument has to do with interest in particular topics and a certain sort of sensitivity.
Yeah, I would say that, if that's the case, to use the example of what I would say, I reject that proposal. because that somehow, people like different things. I like different magazines than my wife does. Is my magazine a better magazine? No. I mean, I like a very good version of my magazine. She likes a very good version of her magazine, but our magazines are entirely gendered. And that's not without a coincidence. If you go to the magazine racks, they're very gendered. And then there's the overlap areas. Obviously, there's overlap areas like the news magazines. But there's very gendered interest in magazines. So why shouldn't that play itself out? Now, what you should do is to say science is what it is. You excel, you get funded. Music is what it is. Should music be made of exactly 80% white people, 10% black people, 10% Hispanic people, and 0.1% other? Because that's the population of the US, or whatever the population is. No, it turns out popular music, rock and roll, was invented, most of 20th century music throughout the world was invented by poor African American men. Blues, jazz, rock and roll, hip hop, and for what it's worth, if you want to toss on calypso and reggae if you like, because I like them, then you'll say that all of great 20th century music, with small exception, was nucleated by poor black men. Quantum mechanics, a good fraction of it was by Ashkenazi Jewish men. And that's just what happened. That is history. We have to accept that. And you can say, I like it or I don't like it, but that's just what happened. It didn't happen if other people did it. And you can't go around saying that you should look like this or look like that. I think it's absolutely the case that men and women are different and will probably value different things. So as a case in point, I think it's common, for example, for women to say, I want to find a way to balance my work and life. The work-life balance is not an uncommon thing for women, especially as they get older and more professionally advanced. It is not so common for men to say that as they become older and more professionally advanced. We have different interests. Males and females often have different interests in that female interests tend to be more broad in bandwidth, and male interests tend to be more narrow with depth, with the same amount of work exposed. Let's say it's just a question of how you tend to pursue your computing speed. But men and women do different things. Having said that, maybe we even do science differently. But as long as you do the same science, it's fine.
Endosymbiosis, that was one of her great contributions to biology. I don't know why I can't remember her name.
I will say actually that I have a colleague who, when we discuss gender a lot, and gender and race and all these issues a lot, and she is a Jewish woman who's a scientist, and so we're both sort of like off the beaten path as independent contractors. We think about things and culture and whatnot, and she describes how her type of science is done like gathering, and I describe how I do my with science as like hunting, and we both do similar but different science. In her case, it involves a lot of pattern recognition, and for me, it's hunting for a white whale. So we have different types of doing science, but in that sense, maybe there will be differences in values as well. So that's actually an interesting point, because maybe the science that women like to do is somehow different, but I don't see any evidence of that yet. And if there is, then I think anybody would say, well, that looks interesting, because the most interesting thing is the thing you haven't thought of or done as a scientist. So what you want, what you're looking for, is someone else who offers a value proposition, which is something that you've not thought of. And that would be the greatest thing on earth as a scientist, is someone who showed you something new. So why wouldn't you want that?
While Regan's thinking his question through, I was also interested in the point about the fields, nursing and the like, that are heavily female. And you seem to be wondering, well, why isn't there a push to recruit more men and then indeed bring rules and policies that would favor
Sure.
men.
Suppose men bring something to teaching and nursing, and I think in that case, I think it's very clear that men would bring something to teaching and nursing. I don't think it's clear that women and other colors bring something to science or firefighting. Firefighting and police work are very different. I talked about this with my wife, that we both think that police work could really benefit from a diversity of people, because you're interacting with people in high stress situations. Fire people should probably be big, strong men, people, big, strong people, who are largely going to be men of European descent. They're not going to be East Asian, unless you're from Mongolia. In that case, yes.
Well, one of the reasons that there might not be a push there, policy-wise, is the thought that, well, if we have policies that favor women in STEM fields, then the women who otherwise would be in these other occupations, nursing and the rest, would be able to fulfill their desires. And
fulfill what desires?
Well, the thought is, I take it, that they would rather be doing chemistry than nursing. But there are barriers that are preventing them from entry into the fields that they would rather enter into. But as they enter into these fields, well, then that opens up opportunities for men in nursing and the other highly female professions. My point is that the argument might be that there doesn't need to be active policies favoring men in the women-heavy jobs, because those are women-heavy because that's where the women end up because of lack of opportunity.
Sounds like a chicken-egg problem that somebody just made up. Which came first? And I think the more silly proposition is that there aren't women in STEM because of lack of encouragement in the year 2020. In the year 1820 or 1920, maybe. In the year 1950, sure. In the year 1980, I don't think so. And I was a kid then. But in the year 2020, I would say absolutely not, and certainly not for races. And again, the question of race versus gender is a very different thing. So there are preferences for women in teachers and nurses. They are women, and we trust them more. If you ask men who are teachers, they're not given as much trust and empathy and power as the women are. They're not trusted as much.
Well, so you think there are barriers then?
There are huge barriers to men that prevent men to go into teaching. And men are often accused of being the bad guy in society, when often there are harms done by women as well. So there's this idea that we put women on there's this idea of, if there's idea of a misogyny, there's also an idea of gynocentrism, which is that we assign specific value to women, and things that involve nurturing, like teachers and daycare people. Those are valuable things inside. They might not pay a lot, but they also have moral authority. So what women tend to have is moral authority and guidance of people. So that's why, for example, a lot of the social justice stuff is gendered. It's mostly women that are doing these sort of social justice things. It's not men who are engineers that are doing this sort of thing. It's women in the humanities. It's very gendered, it seems like. And that's the thing I talk about with Gad Saad, and Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson will also tell you that these phenomena, social justice warriors, are often gendered, and the leftists are often gendered, the extremists. And I think there's a phenomena for this, and it's involving moralization as a strategy to execute power. And it's not something common. It's more common of women to do that because they do that with kids and building social networks. And that's becoming how they're exerting political power, is through moralization. Okay. So why are there barriers? I don't know. Are there barriers to anyone and everyone? Sure. I've experienced many barriers in my life, but having said that, what do you do with barriers? You overcome them. You move on. And those barriers then disappear eventually with time, but you can't go around engineering them away because you don't know enough about the problem. And if you want to do that, at least you should be consistent about applying the same amount of effort for all people of all walks of life. You shouldn't be going around doing it with selective empathy, because that would be apartheid.
Okay, so as a student in STEM, I'm in my 4th year of physics now. It's my sense that the EDI initiatives emergent in the scientific institutions are not a product of the scientists themselves, but rather sort of, I would say, subordinates in management positions, administrative positions, who are kind of imposing these conditions. For instance, one institution from my hometown seems to have all of a sudden adopted sort of gendered pronouns and email signatures and things of that nature. And of course, there are other speakers in the conferences who they sponsor who are sort of physics adjacent, trying to discuss for lack of a better term, race and gender statistics in physicists. Is this consistent with what you've observed as well? And how do you get the scientists who are so focused on what they're doing, learning about neutrinos and whatnot, to look up from their work and go, hey, this is kind of interfering with the quality of the people who I can bring onto my team. So, I mean,
right. I think that's exactly what happened. We have an EDI office at McGill that occupies many people, employs many people. There are studies about the University of Michigan, I think done by Mark Perry, where he documents how big the EDI office, and it's run by a $5 million budget or something like that. So this is big business. And these people have jobs, and they're not going to lose their jobs. They're government officials. And their job is to implement EDI, and their job is to tell us what to do. So the government actually is telling the universities, unless you do this, you will lose your funding. And then the scientists have been looking the other way for the last 10 years, and now are awakening. So I get a lot of feedback from scientists saying they agree with me, but they're afraid to say so out loud. And generally people are afraid to say so out loud that they disagree with what is being thrust upon them by people who are not scientists. And that's why I, for example, asked the question, why is it that the non-scientists are uniquely judging us? Shouldn't we reverse the valve and judge them? Frankly, I prefer no one go around judging each other like the Old Testament. But having said that, if you're going to go around doing it, at least we have reason, logic, and evidence on our side. You don't have that. I don't know what you have, but you don't have reason, logic, and evidence on your side.
Pat, my first degree was from McGill, so it's my alma mater, and I, for years, have been getting a call annually for donations, which for years I've been happy to give. This past year, I got the call, and anticipating this, I actually checked the McGill website to see how big the operation is at McGill to implement EDI policies. And I counted 26 people, all no doubt exceedingly well paid. At an institution like ours here at St. Mary's, it's much, much smaller. But we are doing our best to catch up because there have been recent administrative hirings in recent years, a couple of them very, very recent. But it's an effort to replicate this here at St. Mary's. And these people are hired expressly to engineer outcomes, to run interference on the academic front, and to ensure that the academic merit of applicants for academic positions is diminished significantly in order to ensure outcomes on other grounds. Your last point in your presentation was what we can do. And I refused to give money this time for the first time in many, many years. First time ever that I've refused it. And I wonder what you think that alumni can do.
I think it's a fantastic question.
And also, kind of related to that, given that so many people have contacted you, particularly since the article in the National Post appeared, is it mainly fellow academics, fellow scientists, or have there been some alumni contacting you expressing concerns about what's happening to their institutions?
Yes. I think that to answer the second question first, the people that have contacted me have been literally of all walks of life, not just academics, whether students or professors, young or old. That's certainly been the case, but citizens, just people from all over Canada, in some case the US, some case outside Canada, some case from Japan, some case from, all over the world. So mostly people who are immigrants, interestingly enough, saying that I want to be judged on meritocracy and nothing else, and I came to Canada or America because they were the best places in which I could operate under the principles of meritocracy and freedom and liberty. And that's why I came to these places from my own home country, where it was harder to live under maybe difficult circumstances. And so it was the immigrant. I got the most striking letters from the immigrants saying, and this is bogus, this does not speak for me, I want meritocracy. And in this case, the idea of being merit, fairness, and equality rather than equity, diversity, and inclusion. So equity, diversity, and inclusion is sort of kindergarten speak, but it makes you feel good about yourself. But it's a ruse. It's just like communism sounds great, but until you actually think about it for 5 minutes. You don't even have to say for communism that it was a good idea in practice and a bad idea in experiment, because that's preposterous. That'd be the world's worst idea then, if every single experiment you did failed. It'd be a horrible idea. No, it's a horrible idea after thinking about it for 1 minute, because you realize that communism involves selling of the human soul to the state. It's not just that sharing things is good. Everyone wants to share and be nice. Communism is not being nice. It's about selling your soul to the state. And that's not a nice thing at all. So I think that we as alumni, not we as alumni, I as an alumnus to my alma maters, 2 of them would say, I'm not going to give you money. One of them in particular is very woke. My undergraduate, Carleton College in Minnesota, is very woke and wealthy, as American private liberal arts colleges that are selective are. And they're the most woke places on earth, especially in the Northeast. Mine was in Minnesota, so it's a little bit, it's still as woke as, say, the Northeast ones. And Jonathan Haidt at NYU has actually done surveys on this and studies on this, saying that the most woke places tend to be the American New England liberal arts colleges, the elite ones. And so that's the sort of place I went to, and I wouldn't give them money. Absolutely not. I mean, they have a lot of reformation to do, and I would say to the alumni, and especially to the wealthy alumni and to the donors, don't give money to universities until universities reform. You can offer that wisdom, and donors in the past have offered some constraints. Maybe they say don't give money if you do evolution research or this, that, and the other research, or there should be constraints without a doubt, but the donors should be able to exert their influence and say, you should be able to produce a good return on my investment, and the return on my investment should be done in a way to nucleate reason, logic, evidence, inquiry, principles, discovery, academic scholarship. Those are the sort of things we're here to do at a university. We are not here to run a social work organization. There are other things. We're not the Red Cross, we're not the firemen, we're not this, that, and the other. We are here to do scholarship. And if you want to give money for scholarship, you should support scholarship, not the absence thereof. And this diversity, inclusion, and equity woke cult is representing the absence of scholarship and the absence of meritocracy and the absence of fairness and the absence of excellence. And that's also where the taxpayers should care. You, the taxpayer, are paying for the university. The universities are not producing you a good return on investment because they don't value excellence. What they value is diversity, and the two have nothing to do with each other.
Is there any evidence at McGill of any kind of groundswell, however modest, on the part of
Questioning things?
well, not just questioning things. I'm talking about alumni, among alumni, to resist
I've not
this.
heard from alumni, and I've not heard from alumni anywhere, and let alone McGill. So I've been keeping my ear to the ground for the last number of years, and I've not heard alumni writing articles. Where they would do so is probably at the National Review or the Wall Street Journal in America. They would not publish it in the New York Times, probably. But nonetheless, if a rich alumnus wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal saying that that he or she were opposed to a lot of what was happening in universities, and they wanted them to return to their classical liberal roots that were so nicely working as recently as 1990-ish, I think that would be a wonderful thing. Absolutely wonderful thing. And I think that means every person can do what they can in their own level. You, the taxpayer, can say, I'm going to vote for my MP or senator, or somehow based upon these ideas. Do you support critical race theory? Do you support diversity, inclusion, and equity? Or do you support merit, fairness, and equality? You actually ask these questions, and you ask that of the person that you're voting for. You ask that of your educators. You ask that of the teachers of your children. The teachers of your children should be asked these questions, because if the teachers of your children might be teaching critical race theory, diversity, inclusion, and equity, and coloring how they think and what they think. And that's, I think, absolutely happening to your kids. So at all levels, we can and should stand up and do what we can as individuals, because there is a lot of force that we are working against that is collective, but I think it will dissipate out of fear if this force recognizes that there are people standing up and saying, no, I simply reject your proposal, let's discuss. And then the dust falls, the dust settles.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
Lynn Margulis, that's the scientist whose name escaped me.
Sounds familiar.
Do you remember? Well, there are three things. One, endosymbiosis, and then she was central to the formation of the Gaia hypothesis, and then she was did important work in the expanding of the number of kingdoms of living things. Remember, there used to be 3, then there were 5, 7. And the rest. So anyway, those were her accomplishments, Lynn Margulis. But I wanted to address a third justification for policies that favor women and minorities in grant giving and hiring and the rest, and see what you think of it. This is the one I think is the, to my mind, it's the ugliest of the many justifications I've heard. I want to know what you think. But it goes like this. Excellence. Don't worry about excellence. Excellence will take care of itself. The geniuses are very few. They will find positions because they'll be recognized as excellent, as superior. And then we're left with everyone else. Now, what's the principle or the rule called where, say, 10% of the group produces 50% of the work?
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone remember? Pardon me? Price's Law, yes. Price's Law. Take a group of academics in a department. Say you have 20 academics in that department. It turns out that 50% of the papers published will be by 2%, and then the other 50% will be distributed around the rest. So the thought is that as long as and I hear this argument in humanities, maybe social sciences, but I haven't heard it addressed to STEM disciplines. But it doesn't matter as long as the candidates, the candidates for the job, meet a certain standard. But once they're past that standard, you recognize the geniuses, and yes, hire them, but everyone else is pretty much the same. So you might as well go for non-academic criteria, so that
right. That's precisely what's frequently pitched. I reject that proposal, and I think it is completely empirically unfounded, and it's intellectually unsound as well, just from inspection. There's a huge distribution of abilities. We can call it a bell curve if you want to. It doesn't need to be a bell curve. In fact, there could be other curves. There's actually, in statistics, many other functions like that. Some could be symmetric, like a bell. Some could be asymmetric. Nonetheless, there are distributions. The distribution has an average, and most importantly, has a width. The average is often not important. The width is usually the more important thing. So there's a width to the distribution of how tall people are, or whatever you measure. For anything you measure, you're going to find a distribution, and that's true from atoms to people. So everywhere you have a distribution. And so what that means is there are people that are 1 standard deviation away from the mean, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And obviously there's going to be some geniuses out there too. It depends what you want to call that genius. 6 standard deviations? Is that 1 in a million or 1 in a billion? I don't know, but nonetheless something like that. Is the average scientist at an average Research 1 university a genius? Not really. But on the other hand, by the standards of their neighbors, maybe so, because they've been the best in their business of science ever since they were 10 years old, and they made it through loops from age 10 till age 30 to reach the point of being a professor. So on some level, that's a pretty good thing. Is it a genius? Probably not really, but it's still on the realm of the spectrum. So I know people that I think are geniuses, not necessarily Einstein geniuses, not necessarily find them geniuses, but I certainly know people that I think are geniuses. And that's not unreasonable in most of practicing science, to know people that you think are, some fraction of the people you think are geniuses. If you ask in regular everyday life what fraction of the people you think are geniuses, maybe you think it's 1 in a million. For me, I would say it's probably 1 to 10% of the people I know are geniuses. Could be 10%. I know a lot of geniuses. I feel like I know a handful of geniuses, and it's a thing. But I also know a lot of other people who are really, really, really smart at everything, at almost everything. And that corresponds to a lot of scientists as well. It's just people that are very, 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 very smart. And there's more of those people. But it's not like there's a threshold. And it's so infrequent to find someone like that that's very talented and also has done the work that happens to be interesting at the time, relevant at the time. To find the combination of that is very rare. So it's usually hugely different, the difference in what the people have done or their talent or their papers, and it's incredibly hard to say this person is better or worse. And there's going to be a spectrum. It's always going to be a spectrum. And people usually don't agree upon the person anyway, and there's rarely a consensus. But I don't see how there's ever this magical situation where there's 5 people and they're all above threshold, so we pick the one who is diverse in whatever manner. That would never ever happen. That's the most inconceivable situation I can imagine, and I've been on a dozen hiring committees. Maybe not a dozen, maybe 10, But I've been on plenty of hiring committees, and that's absolutely inconceivable.
Okay. And I think we're out of time.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.